The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse as three young men walked up the marble steps together. Marcus, Michael, and Matthew Johnson moved with identical confident strides, their dark suits pressed and their heads held high. At 25 years old, the triplets had grown into impressive men, but today their usual easy smiles were replaced by expressions of grim determination. Inside the courthouse lobby, they found their mother sitting alone on a wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Grace Johnson looked smaller than usual in her navy blue dress, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. When she saw her sons approaching, her eyes filled with tears of both relief and worry. "Boys, you didn't have to come," she whispered as they surrounded her, each taking a protective position. "This is my burden to carry." Marcus, the eldest by 3 minutes, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mama, we're not boys anymore, and your burdens are our burdens. We're family." The reason they were all gathered in this cold, imposing building traced back to a terrible accident that had happened 6 months earlier. Grace Johnson, who had worked as a home healthcare aide for 15 years, was accused of neglecting her elderly patient, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. The 90-year-old woman had fallen while Grace was briefly away from the house, resulting in a broken hip and serious complications that led to her death weeks later. The Whitfield family, led by Eleanor's son Richard, was seeking criminal charges against Grace for negligent homicide. They claimed she had abandoned her post to run personal errands, leaving a vulnerable elderly woman alone and unattended. The prosecution painted Grace as a careless, money-hungry caregiver who put her own needs above her patient's safety. What made the situation even more painful was the racial undertone that seemed to permeate every aspect of the case. Grace had been one of the few black healthcare workers in the affluent Riverside neighborhood where the Whitfields lived. Several neighbors had already given statements suggesting they had always been suspicious of Grace, describing her as different from the other caregivers and not quite right for the position. The triplets had grown up watching their mother pour her heart into caring for others. After their father died in a construction accident when they were just 10 years old, Grace had worked double shifts to keep food on the table and clothes on their backs. She never missed a parent-teacher conference, never failed to attend their basketball games, and somehow always found money for school supplies and field trips. Grace had trained to become a certified nursing assistant and then specialized in elderly care. Her patients and their families had always loved her gentle touch, her patient listening, and her ability to bring comfort to those in their final years. She kept photo albums full of thank you cards and letters from grateful families whose loved ones had been in her care. But the Whitfield case was different. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield had been one of Grace's most challenging patients, suffering from advancing dementia that made her confused and sometimes aggressive. The family had specifically requested a live-in caregiver, and Grace had moved into the small apartment above the Whitfield garage to provide round-the-clock care. According to the police report and the prosecution's case, on the day of the accident, Grace had left the house to go grocery shopping, leaving Mrs. Whitfield alone for approximately 45 minutes. During that time, the elderly woman had apparently tried to get out of bed on her own, fallen, and been unable to call for help. A neighbor had eventually heard her cries and called 911. The defense attorney assigned to Grace's case was a young public defender named Jennifer Walsh, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed with cases. While she seemed well-meaning, the triplets could see she was outmatched by the prosecution team, which included 2 experienced lawyers and a private investigator hired by the Whitfield family. During the preliminary hearings, it became clear that this case was about much more than a tragic accident. The prosecution presented witness after witness who testified about Grace's questionable behavior. They claimed she had been seen leaving the house at odd hours, receiving phone calls during work time, and acting suspicious around the neighborhood. Marcus, who had earned his law degree from Howard University but worked as a public interest lawyer, immediately recognized the coded language being used against his mother. Michael, a social worker who specialized in elder care advocacy, understood the systemic issues that often blamed caregivers for the inevitable tragedies that occurred with aging patients. Matthew, an investigative journalist for the city newspaper, had covered enough courthouse proceedings to know when a case was being shaped by prejudice rather than facts. The 3 brothers had decided to take action. While they couldn't officially represent their mother, they could use their skills and connections to help build a real defense. Marcus began researching similar cases and legal precedents. Michael started investigating the standards of care in the elderly healthcare industry. Matthew began digging into the background of the case, looking for details that the overworked public defender might have missed. What they discovered in their initial research was troubling. The Whitfield family had gone through 4 different caregivers in the year before hiring Grace. Each previous caregiver had quit or been fired, with complaints ranging from incompatible personality to failure to meet family expectations. The turnover was unusual, even for families dealing with dementia patients. More concerning was what Matthew discovered about Richard Whitfield's financial situation. Eleanor Whitfield had been a wealthy widow, with substantial property holdings and investments. Her death meant that Richard, as her only heir, would inherit everything. But if her death could be attributed to negligent care, there might be grounds for additional insurance payouts or lawsuits against the healthcare agency that had placed Grace. The brothers also learned that Grace had been hired through a reputable agency that required extensive background checks, training certificates, and regular performance evaluations. Grace's file with the agency was spotless, with glowing reviews from previous families and supervisors. She had never had a single complaint filed against her in 15 years of service. During their investigation, they also discovered something that the prosecution had failed to mention in their case. On the day of the accident, Grace had not simply gone grocery shopping on a whim. She had received an emergency call from the pharmacy informing her that Mrs. Whitfield's critical heart medication was ready for pickup and needed to be collected before the pharmacy closed for a 3-day weekend. Grace had faced an impossible choice: leave Mrs. Whitfield alone for the time it would take to retrieve life-saving medication, or allow her patient to go without her heart pills for 3 days. Following her training and her conscience, she had made the difficult decision to quickly retrieve the medication, planning to be gone for no more than 30 minutes. The pharmacy records confirmed that Grace had indeed picked up medication for Eleanor Whitfield that afternoon, and the timestamps showed she had been away from the house for exactly 38 minutes. The accident had occurred during the final 10 minutes of her absence, just as she was driving back to the house. None of this information had been presented by the prosecution, and the overworked public defender had not discovered it during her limited case preparation. The brothers realized that their mother was being railroaded, and they were determined to fight back. As they sat in the courthouse that morning, waiting for the trial to begin, Grace looked at her 3 sons with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She had sacrificed everything to give them opportunities she had never had, and now they were using those opportunities to fight for her. "I'm sorry I brought this shame on our family," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the busy courthouse corridor. Michael took her hand and squeezed it firmly. "Mama, you have never brought shame on anyone. You've spent your life caring for others, and now it's time for us to care for you." The courtroom doors opened, and they could see people filing in for the start of the trial. The prosecution team entered with confidence, carrying boxes of files and evidence. Behind them came members of the Whitfield family, dressed in expensive black clothing and wearing expressions of righteous grief. Jennifer Walsh, Grace's public defender, approached them with an apologetic look. "I'm going to do my best," she said quietly, "but I have to be honest with you. The prosecution has a strong case, and I'm limited in what I can present without more preparation time." Marcus exchanged glances with his brothers. They had already made their decision. "Ms. Walsh," he said formally, "my brothers and I would like to request permission to assist with my mother's defense. We're not trying to take over your case, but we have information that might be helpful." The young lawyer looked surprised and then relieved. "Any help you can provide would be welcome. This case has been challenging from the beginning." As they prepared to enter the courtroom, Matthew pulled out his notebook filled with research findings. Michael opened his briefcase containing documentation about healthcare standards and protocols. Marcus carried a folder of legal precedents and case law that might apply to their mother's situation. The bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Harrison entered the courtroom. Judge William Harrison was a stern-looking man in his early 60s, known for running a strict courtroom and having little patience for delays or disruptions. His reputation was that of a fair but uncompromising judge who followed the law without sentiment. As Grace took her seat at the defendant's table with her attorney, the triplets positioned themselves in the front row of the gallery, directly behind her. Their presence was a visible reminder that she was not alone in this fight. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Lead prosecutor Daniel Morrison painted a picture of a negligent caregiver who had abandoned a helpless elderly woman to pursue her own interests. He described Eleanor Whitfield as a frail, vulnerable victim who had trusted Grace with her life, only to be betrayed by someone who put convenience above responsibility. Morrison's voice carried the weight of moral authority as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about trust. Eleanor Whitfield trusted Grace Johnson to keep her safe. Eleanor's family trusted Grace Johnson to provide the care their mother needed. The healthcare agency trusted Grace Johnson to represent them professionally. And Grace Johnson violated every single one of those trusts when she chose to leave a 90-year-old dementia patient alone in a house where anything could happen." He went on to describe the accident in graphic detail, emphasizing Eleanor's pain and confusion as she lay on the floor for nearly an hour before being discovered. He presented testimony from neighbors who described Grace as standoffish and unreliable, and medical experts who testified that leaving a dementia patient alone was a clear violation of standard care protocols. When it was time for the defense's opening statement, Jennifer Walsh stood up nervously, clearly intimidated by the prosecution's polished presentation. She spoke briefly about Grace's long history of excellent care and her dedication to her patients, but her argument lacked the power and conviction of the prosecution's case. The triplets could see that their mother was fighting back tears as the prosecution's witnesses took the stand one by one. Each testimony seemed to paint her as a careless, untrustworthy person who had failed in her most basic responsibilities. The first witness was Richard Whitfield himself. The evening after the first day of trial, the Johnson family gathered in Grace's small apartment above Mrs. Chen's restaurant in the downtown area. The walls were decorated with photos of the triplets at various stages of their lives, from gap-toothed elementary school pictures to their college graduation ceremonies. Grace had insisted on cooking dinner despite the emotional exhaustion from the day's proceedings. Marcus spread legal documents across the kitchen table while Michael and Matthew organized their research findings. Grace moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing her famous pot roast as if maintaining normal routines could somehow make the nightmare they were living feel less real. "Mama, you need to sit down and let us handle this," Michael said gently, but Grace shook her head. "Cooking helps me think," she replied, seasoning the vegetables with practiced precision. "Besides, you boys need a good meal if you're going to help me fight this battle." The triplets had spent years watching their mother handle crisis with this same combination of practical action and quiet strength. When their father had died, she had grieved privately while working extra shifts to keep their family afloat. When Marcus had been arrested as a teenager for a fight that wasn't his fault, she had researched the law and found the evidence that cleared his name. When Michael had struggled with depression during college, she had driven 4 hours every weekend to bring him home-cooked meals and emotional support. Now it was their turn to protect her, and they were discovering just how complex and challenging that task would be. Marcus had spent the evening reviewing the prosecution's witness list and was troubled by what he found. "They are planning to call several neighbors who claimed they observed Grace acting suspiciously," he told his brothers. "But look at the pattern of their statements. They all describe the same incidents, using almost identical language." He showed them copies of the witness statements obtained through discovery. Mrs. Henderson from next door claimed she had seen Grace sneaking around the property at odd hours. Mr. Patterson from across the street said he had witnessed Grace acting nervous and evasive when questioned about her activities. Mrs. Caldwell from the corner house stated that Grace had been untrustworthy from the beginning and not the type of person who belonged in the neighborhood. "This feels orchestrated," Matthew said, his journalist instincts recognizing the signs of a coordinated campaign. Real witness testimony usually varies in details and perspective. This reads like someone coached them on what to say. Michael had been researching the healthcare agency that had placed Grace with the Whitfield family, and his findings raised additional questions. "Comfort Care Solutions has an excellent reputation," he reported. They've been in business for 12 years, and Grace is the first employee who has ever faced criminal charges. But here's what's interesting, they dropped Grace immediately after the accident, without any investigation or due process. This was significant because it suggested that even Grace's employer had been pressured to distance themselves from her case. Typically, healthcare agencies would conduct their own investigation before terminating an employee, especially one with Grace's track record. I talked to 3 of Grace's former clients today, Michael continued. Mrs. Rodriguez, who Grace cared for 2 years ago, said Grace was the most dedicated caregiver she'd ever seen. Mr. Thompson's daughter told me that Grace had actually prevented her father from having a serious fall by recognizing the early warning signs of a medical emergency. Grace paused in her cooking, tears forming in her eyes. Those were good families, she said softly. I loved taking care of their parents. It never felt like work when I could make someone's final years more comfortable. Matthew had been investigating the Whitfield family's history, and what he discovered painted a picture that was very different from the grieving relatives portrayed in court. Richard Whitfield has significant financial problems, he reported. His construction company has been struggling for 2 years, and he owes money to several contractors and suppliers. The journalist in Matthew had also uncovered records showing that Eleanor Whitfield's previous caregivers had all left under questionable circumstances. The first caregiver, a woman named Susan Martinez, had quit after just 3 weeks, citing impossible working conditions and unrealistic family expectations. The second caregiver, an experienced man named Robert Chen, had been fired after 1 month for failure to meet family standards, though he had received excellent evaluations from the healthcare agency. The third caregiver was Angela Morrison, a woman with 20 years of experience, Matthew continued. She lasted 2 months before being terminated. I managed to contact her this evening, and she told me some very interesting things about the Whitfield family dynamics. According to Angela Morrison, Richard Whitfield had been pressuring his mother to make changes to her will and financial arrangements. Eleanor Whitfield, despite her dementia, had been resistant to these suggestions and had become increasingly agitated when the topic was raised. The tension between mother and son had made the caregiving environment extremely difficult. Angela also mentioned that Richard had specifically requested caregivers from certain neighborhoods, Matthew added carefully. He seemed to prefer hiring women who might be more vulnerable to intimidation if problems arose. The implications of this information were serious. If Richard Whitfield had deliberately hired caregivers he thought would be easy to blame for any problems, it suggested a level of premeditation that would completely change the nature of the case. Marcus had been researching the legal precedents for cases involving caregiver liability, and the results were mixed. The law is actually somewhat sympathetic to caregivers who make reasonable decisions in emergency situations, he explained. But the key word is reasonable. We need to prove that Grace's decision to leave Mrs. Whitfield to get her medication was not only reasonable but necessary. This brought them to the crucial evidence they had discovered, the pharmacy records showing that Grace had been retrieving Eleanor's heart medication. But even this evidence had complications. The prosecution will argue that Grace should have called Richard or another family member to retrieve the medication, Marcus continued. Or that she should have contacted the healthcare agency for guidance. We need to show that Grace had legitimate reasons for handling the situation herself. Michael had been thinking about this problem from his perspective as a social worker who dealt with elderly care situations regularly. The reality is that emergency situations require immediate decisions, he said. When you're responsible for someone's life, you can't always wait for committee approval. Grace was trained to prioritize her patients' medical needs above all other considerations. Grace finally sat down at the table with them, her pot roast simmering in the background. For the first time since the trial began, she looked ready to actively participate in planning her defense. I need to tell you boys something about that day, she said quietly. Something I haven't even told my lawyer because I was afraid it would make things worse. The triplets leaned forward, giving their mother their complete attention. Mrs. Whitfield didn't just need her heart medication, Grace continued. She had been having episodes where her heart would race and she would become very confused and agitated. The doctor had told me that missing even one dose of her medication could trigger a serious cardiac event. This was crucial information that added urgency to Grace's decision to leave the house. If Eleanor Whitfield was at immediate risk of a heart attack without her medication, Grace's choice to retrieve the pills could be seen as a life-saving decision rather than negligent abandonment. "But there's more," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. That morning, Richard had called and told me that he was coming to visit his mother in the afternoon. Mrs. Whitfield became very upset after that phone call. She kept saying she didn't want to see him, and she tried to hide her jewelry and important papers. The triplets exchanged glances. This information painted a picture of a family situation that was far more complicated than the prosecution had suggested. "Mama, why didn't you tell your lawyer about this?" Marcus asked gently. Grace looked down at her hands. "Because Richard Whitfield is a prominent white man in this town, and I'm a black woman who works as a caregiver. Who's going to believe my word against his? I was afraid that talking about family problems would just make me look like someone who gossips about her employers." This response revealed the deeper issue underlying the entire case. Grace had been navigating a professional environment where she constantly had to prove her worth and trustworthiness, where any mistake could be attributed to her race rather than to the inherent challenges of her work. She had learned to keep quiet about problems and focus on providing excellent care, but that same instinct was now preventing her from defending herself effectively. Matthew realized that this case was about much more than a workplace accident. It was about systemic inequalities that made women like his mother vulnerable to being scapegoated when tragedies occurred. The prosecution was counting on the jury's unconscious biases to fill in the gaps in their evidence. "We need to change the narrative," he said firmly. "Right now, the prosecution is telling a story about a careless caregiver who abandoned her patient. We need to tell the real story about a dedicated professional who made a difficult decision to save her patient's life." Marcus began drafting a revised defense strategy that would focus on Grace's decision-making process rather than trying to minimize the tragedy of Eleanor's death. "We're not going to argue that this wasn't a terrible accident," he explained. "We're going to show that Grace did everything a reasonable, trained caregiver would do in her situation." Michael suggested bringing in expert witnesses who could testify about the standards of care for dementia patients and the types of emergency decisions that caregivers face regularly. "We need the jury to understand that caring for someone with dementia involves constant risk assessment and decision-making. Perfect safety isn't possible, but professional judgment is." As they planned their strategy, Grace prepared plates of pot roast for her sons, just as she had done thousands of times during their childhood. But tonight felt different. Tonight, they were not just her children seeking comfort and guidance. They were her partners in a fight that would determine the rest of her life. The next morning, the prosecution continued presenting their case with a series of witnesses designed to establish a pattern of negligent behavior. Mrs. Henderson, the next-door neighbor, took the stand wearing a conservative dress and carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. "Grace Johnson was not like the other caregivers who worked in our neighborhood," Mrs. Henderson testified. "She kept to herself and didn't seem to understand her place. I often saw her coming and going at strange hours, and she never seemed to be doing the kind of activities you would expect from someone in her position." Under cross-examination, Jennifer Walsh tried to challenge these vague accusations, but Mrs. Henderson's testimony had clearly made an impression on the jury. Several jurors were nodding along with her statements, and Marcus could see that the prosecution's strategy was working. The pattern continued with Mr. Patterson, who testified about Grace's suspicious behavior and her apparent lack of integration into the neighborhood community. His testimony included subtle but clear implications about Grace not fitting in with the area's expectations and standards. What troubled the triplets most was not just the content of these testimonies, but the way the witnesses delivered them. Each person spoke with confidence and moral authority, presenting their opinions as if they were established facts. The coded language of racial bias was being wrapped in concerns about professionalism and community standards. During the lunch break, the triplets huddled with Jennifer Walsh to discuss their strategy for the afternoon's cross-examinations. Marcus had identified several inconsistencies in the witness statements that could be exploited, while Matthew had discovered background information about some of the witnesses that might affect their credibility. Mrs. Henderson has called the police on 4 different black service workers in the past 2 years, Matthew reported. 3 complaints about suspicious activity by delivery drivers, and 1 about a landscaping crew acting inappropriately. All of the complaints were investigated and found to be baseless. This pattern suggested that Mrs. Henderson's testimony about Grace might be motivated by racial bias rather than legitimate concerns about professional conduct. However, introducing this information would require careful handling to avoid alienating the jury. Michael had researched the neighborhood's history and discovered that the Riverside area had been the subject of several housing discrimination lawsuits over the years. There's a documented pattern of resistance to diversity in this neighborhood, he told the defense team. Grace wasn't just caring for Mrs. Whitfield, she was living in a community that had historically been hostile to black residents. As the trial resumed, Jennifer Walsh began her cross-examinations with new confidence, armed with the information the triplets had provided. When she questioned Mrs. Henderson about her previous complaints to police, the neighbor became defensive and evasive. "I have a responsibility to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood," Mrs. Henderson insisted. "Crime is a serious problem, and we all need to be vigilant. But isn't it true that all of your complaints about suspicious activity have involved black service workers?" Walsh pressed. The prosecution objected, and Judge Harrison sustained the objection, but the point had been made. Several jurors looked uncomfortable with the implication of the question. The afternoon brought more prosecution witnesses, including the emergency medical technicians who had responded to Eleanor Whitfield's fall. Their testimony focused on the medical consequences of the delay in treatment, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that Grace's absence had contributed to the elderly woman's death. But, as the EMT testified about the timeline of events, the triplets noticed something important. According to the medical records, Eleanor Whitfield had fallen approximately 35 minutes after Grace left the house, not immediately as the prosecution had implied. This meant that even if Grace had been present, she might not have been in the room when the accident occurred. Marcus quickly passed this information to Jennifer Walsh, who incorporated it into her cross-examination. "So according to your records, Mrs. Whitfield's fall occurred at approximately 3:47 p.m., Walsh confirmed with the EMT. "That's correct, based on when we received the emergency call. And, according to the pharmacy records, Grace Johnson left the 3rd day of the trial brought the prosecution's most damaging witnesses, medical experts who would testify about standards of care in the eldercare industry. Dr. Hamilton Reed, a geriatric specialist with 30 years of experience, took the stand wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself with the authority of someone whose word was rarely questioned. Prosecutor Daniel Morrison led Dr. Reed through an impressive recitation of his credentials before focusing on the specific circumstances of Eleanor Whitfield's care. The doctor's testimony was delivered in precise, clinical language that made Grace's decision to leave her patient seem reckless and unprofessional. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Reed stated, "leaving a dementia patient alone, even for a short period, represents a serious breach of care standards. Dementia patients require constant supervision because their condition makes them incapable of making safe decisions about their own welfare." The doctor went on to describe the specific risks associated with leaving Eleanor Whitfield unattended, including the likelihood of falls, confusion, and medical emergencies. His testimony painted a picture of Grace as someone who had ignored basic safety protocols in favor of personal convenience. The defendant had several alternatives available to her, Dr. Reed continued. She could have contacted the patient's family, called the healthcare agency for guidance, or arranged for temporary coverage while she handled the medication pickup. The decision to leave Mrs. Whitfield alone was unnecessary and negligent. Under cross-examination, Jennifer Walsh attempted to challenge Dr. Reed's testimony by asking about the realities of eldercare work, but the doctor's responses were smooth and well-prepared. He acknowledged that eldercare was challenging work, but insisted that professional standards existed precisely to prevent the type of tragedy that had occurred in the Whitfield case. Dr. Reed, Walsh asked, "In your 30 years of practice, have you ever personally provided 24-hour care for a dementia patient?" "I have supervised care teams and consulted on treatment plans for thousands of dementia patients," the doctor replied diplomatically, avoiding a direct answer to the question. But, you haven't personally lived in a patient's home and provided hands-on care around the clock. My role has been to establish protocols and oversee care rather than provide direct service. This exchange highlighted a crucial gap in the expert's testimony. While Dr. Reed was clearly knowledgeable about medical aspects of dementia care, he had never faced the practical, moment-to-moment decisions that caregivers like Grace dealt with every day. The prosecution's next witness was Sandra Williams, a supervisor from Comfort Care Solutions, the agency that had employed Grace. Williams testified about the agency's policies and procedures, emphasizing that employees were strictly forbidden from leaving patients unattended without authorization. Grace Johnson was thoroughly trained in our protocols, Williams stated. She signed documentation acknowledging that she understood the requirement to maintain constant supervision of dementia patients. Her decision to leave Mrs. Whitfield alone was a clear violation of agency policy and her employment agreement. This testimony was particularly damaging because it came from Grace's own employer, giving it the weight of professional authority. Williams described the agency's investigation following Eleanor's death and their decision to terminate Grace's employment immediately. Under cross-examination, Walsh tried to establish that the agency's policies might not cover every emergency situation that could arise in the field. Ms. Williams, do your agency policies address situations where a caregiver must choose between leaving a patient briefly to obtain life-saving medication or allowing the patient to go without necessary medical treatment? Williams hesitated before answering. Our policies generally require caregivers to contact the agency or the patient's family before making any significant decisions. But what if it's after business hours and the family can't be reached immediately? We have an emergency line that operates around the clock. And if that line is busy or the patient needs medication immediately? Williams struggled to provide a specific answer, revealing that the agency's policies, while comprehensive, couldn't possibly cover every emergency scenario that caregivers might face in real-world situations. During the lunch break, the triplets met with Jennifer Walsh to assess the morning's testimony and plan their afternoon strategy. The prosecution's experts had been effective, but their testimony had also revealed some vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Dr. Reed has impressive credentials, but he's never been in Grace's position, Marcus observed. His testimony is based on theoretical best practices, not real-world experience. Michael added, and Williams admitted that agency policies don't cover every possible emergency. We need to show that Grace was facing a situation where following standard procedures might have endangered her patient's life. Matthew had spent the lunch break researching Dr. Reed's background and had discovered some interesting information. Dr. Reed serves on the boards of 3 different healthcare companies that provide services to eldercare facilities, he reported. He has a financial interest in promoting institutional care over home care arrangements. This information suggested that Dr. Reed's testimony might be influenced by professional biases that favored expensive institutional solutions over the kind of personalized home care that Grace provided. It wouldn't discredit his medical expertise, but it might help the jury understand that his perspective represented just one viewpoint in a complex field. The afternoon session brought the prosecution's final expert witness, Robert Chen, a former caregiver who had become a consultant and trainer in the eldercare industry. Chen's testimony was particularly effective because he spoke from experience as someone who had actually worked as a hands-on caregiver before moving into consulting. I've been in situations similar to what Grace Johnson faced, Chen testified. Emergency decisions are part of the job. But the key is following established protocols and putting the patient's immediate safety above all other considerations. Chen described alternative approaches that Grace could have taken, including calling emergency services to check on Eleanor while retrieving the medication, or contacting neighbors who could provide temporary supervision. His testimony was delivered with the credibility of someone who had faced similar challenges in his own caregiving career. The hardest part about this job, Chen continued, is accepting that you can't solve every problem yourself. Sometimes you have to ask for help, even when it's inconvenient or embarrassing. Mrs. Whitfield's safety should have been Grace Johnson's only priority. This testimony was devastating because it came from someone who understood the practical realities of caregiving but still concluded that Grace had made the wrong decision. Chen's background as a former caregiver gave his criticism more weight than the theoretical objections raised by Dr. Reed. However, during cross-examination, Walsh was able to establish that Chen's consulting business specialized in helping healthcare agencies avoid liability in exactly the type of situation that Grace had faced. His financial success depended on promoting policies that protected agencies from lawsuits, which might influence his perspective on caregiver decision-making. Mr. Chen, isn't it true that your consulting company helps healthcare agencies develop policies specifically designed to protect them from liability when accidents occur? Yes, risk management is part of what we do. And, wouldn't those policies typically emphasize avoiding any situation where the agency might be held responsible for a caregiver's independent decision-making? Chen struggled with this question because it exposed the conflict between providing effective patient care and protecting institutional interests. His consulting work focused on minimizing legal exposure rather than optimizing patient outcomes. As the prosecution concluded their case, the triplets recognized that they faced a significant challenge. The expert witnesses had been credible and persuasive, and their testimony had reinforced the narrative that Grace had violated professional standards and caused Eleanor Whitfield's death through negligent decision-making. But the cross-examinations had also revealed weaknesses in the prosecution's case. The experts had impressive credentials but limited real-world experience with the specific challenges Grace had faced. Their testimony reflected institutional perspectives that prioritized policy compliance over patient care outcomes. That evening, the defense team gathered in Grace's apartment to prepare for their presentation of evidence. Jennifer Walsh had gained confidence throughout the trial and was now ready to present a more aggressive defense strategy based on the information the triplets had provided. "We're going to tell a different story," Walsh explained to Grace. "Instead of apologizing for your decision, we're going to show that you made the best choice available under extremely difficult circumstances." The defense strategy would focus on three key elements: Grace's training and experience, the emergency nature of the medication situation, and the lack of viable alternatives given the time constraints she faced. They would present expert witnesses who could testify about the realities of dementia care and the types of split-second decisions that caregivers must make regularly. Marcus had identified Dr. Patricia Santos, a geriatric nurse practitioner who specialized in home care for dementia patients. Dr. Santos had agreed to testify about the challenges caregivers face when balancing competing priorities in emergency situations. Dr. Santos has actually worked as a caregiver herself, Marcus explained. She understands the difference between textbook protocols and real-world decision-making. Her testimony will counter the prosecution's experts who have never been in Grace's position. Michael had located Angela Morrison, the previous caregiver who had worked for the Whitfield family. Morrison had initially been reluctant to get involved in the case, but she had finally agreed to testify about the family dynamics and the challenges of caring for Eleanor Whitfield. Angela's testimony will show that the Whitfield situation was particularly difficult, Michael reported. Eleanor was not just suffering from dementia, she was caught in the middle of family conflicts that made caregiving extremely challenging. Matthew had uncovered additional information about Richard Whitfield's financial situation and his relationship with his mother. While some of this information might not be admissible in court, it provided context that helped explain the family's aggressive pursuit of criminal charges against Grace. Richard Whitfield stands to inherit over $2 million from his mother's estate, Matthew reported. But if he can prove that her death was caused by negligent care, he might be able to collect additional insurance money and pursue civil lawsuits against the healthcare agency. This information suggested that Richard's emotional testimony about seeking justice for his mother might be motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine grief. However, presenting this theory would require careful handling to avoid appearing to attack a grieving son without solid evidence. As they planned their defense strategy, Grace listened quietly, occasionally offering insights about her experience with the Whitfield family and her decision-making process on the day of the accident. For the first time since the trial began, she seemed ready to actively participate in her own defense rather than simply enduring the accusations against her. "I need you to understand something," Grace said to her sons and her lawyer. "I've spent 15 years taking care of other people's parents and grandparents. I've seen families who genuinely love their elderly relatives, and I've seen families who view them as burdens. The Whitfield situation was complicated in ways that go beyond Eleanor's medical condition. Grace described the tension she had observed between Eleanor and her son, including arguments about financial matters and living arrangements. Eleanor had frequently expressed fear that Richard was trying to control her life and take away her independence. Mrs. Whitfield told me several times that she didn't trust Richard with her money, Grace revealed. She said he had been pressuring her to sell the house and move into a nursing facility. She was terrified of losing her home and her autonomy. This testimony would be crucial for the defense because it provided context for Eleanor's emotional state and her resistance to certain family members. If Eleanor had been agitated about family conflicts, it might explain why she had attempted to get out of bed on her own rather than waiting for Grace to return. The triplets realized that their mother had been protecting the Whitfield family's privacy by not revealing these personal details earlier. Grace had maintained professional discretion even when it might have helped her own case, demonstrating the integrity that had made her such a valued caregiver throughout her career. The fourth day of the trial marked the beginning of the defense case, and Jennifer Walsh opened with a confidence that had grown throughout the proceedings. Armed with the research and insights provided by the triplets, she was ready to present a compelling alternative to the prosecution's narrative of negligence and abandonment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Walsh began, "the prosecution has told you a story about a careless caregiver who abandoned her patient. I'm going to tell you the true story about a dedicated professional who made the best decision she could under impossible circumstances." Walsh outlined the defense strategy, focusing on Grace's 15-year career, her specific training in dementia care, and the emergency situation that had forced her to make a split-second decision between two competing priorities, staying with her patient or ensuring her patient had life-saving medication. The first defense witness was Dr. Patricia Santos, the geriatric nurse practitioner who had agreed to testify about the realities of dementia care. Dr. Santos took the stand wearing scrubs rather than a business suit, immediately establishing her as someone who worked directly with patients rather than in boardrooms or consulting offices. Dr. Santos, Walsh began, "Can you tell the jury about your background in elder care?" "I've been a nurse for 22 years, with the last 15 focused specifically on dementia care," Dr. Santos replied in a warm, confident voice. "I've worked in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and private homes. I've also worked as a caregiver myself, providing hands-on care for patients with various stages of dementia." Dr. Santos described the complex decision-making that dementia caregivers face every day, emphasizing that textbook protocols often have to be adapted to real-world situations where multiple factors must be considered simultaneously. "When you're caring for someone with dementia, you're constantly balancing competing risks," Dr. Santos explained. "Every decision involves trade-offs. Do you risk upsetting a patient by insisting on safety measures, or do you prioritize their emotional well-being? Do you follow rigid protocols, or do you adapt to the specific needs of each situation?" Walsh then asked Dr. Santos to review the specific circumstances of Grace's decision on the day of Eleanor Whitfield's accident. Based on the facts presented, Grace Johnson was facing a genuine medical emergency, Dr. Santos testified. Mrs. Whitfield needed her heart medication immediately, and the pharmacy was closing for a long weekend. Allowing a heart patient to go without medication for 3 days could have resulted in a cardiac event that would have been far more serious than the risk of leaving her alone for 30 minutes. This testimony directly contradicted the prosecution's experts, who had focused on the risks of leaving a dementia patient alone without fully considering the medical necessity of retrieving the medication. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Morrison tried to challenge Dr. Santos's assessment, arguing that Grace should have followed standard protocols regardless of the emergency. Dr. Santos, "Wouldn't you agree that protocols exist precisely to prevent caregivers from making subjective judgments that could endanger patients? Protocols provide guidance, but they can't cover every possible situation," Dr. Santos replied firmly. "Good caregiving requires both following procedures and using professional judgment when circumstances demand it." Grace Johnson was trained to prioritize her patient's medical needs, which is exactly what she did. Morrison pressed harder. "But isn't it true that the safest course would have been to call emergency services or contact the family rather than leaving the patient alone?" "In hindsight, perhaps. But Grace had to make a decision in real time, with limited information and competing priorities. Her choice to retrieve life-saving medication was reasonable and appropriate given what she knew at the time. Dr. Santos's testimony was effective because she spoke from direct experience while acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Unlike the prosecution's experts, she didn't claim that there was a simple, obvious solution to the dilemma Grace had faced. The next defense witness was Angela Morrison, the former Whitfield caregiver who had finally agreed to testify despite her initial reluctance. Morrison's testimony promised to provide crucial context about the family dynamics that had made caring for Eleanor Whitfield particularly challenging. Morrison, a middle-aged African-American woman with a dignified bearing, described her 2 months working for the Whitfield family as one of the most difficult assignments of her career. Mrs. Whitfield was not just suffering from dementia, Morrison testified. She was caught in the middle of family conflicts that made her condition worse. She was constantly agitated about her son's visits and would become upset whenever financial matters were discussed. Morrison went on to describe Richard Whitfield's behavior during her time with the family, painting a picture of a son who seemed more interested in his mother's financial affairs than her emotional well-being. Mr. Whitfield would arrive at the house with legal documents and try to pressure his mother into signing papers, Morrison testified. Mrs. Whitfield would become very distressed and would often try to hide her jewelry and important items after these visits. This testimony was explosive because it suggested that Eleanor Whitfield's emotional state had been compromised by family conflicts rather than simply by her medical condition. If Eleanor had been agitated and fearful about her son's intentions, it might explain why she had attempted to get out of bed on her own rather than waiting for Grace to return. Under cross-examination, Morrison stood firm in her account of the family dynamics, despite aggressive questioning from the prosecution. Ms. Morrison, isn't it true that you were fired by the Whitfield family for unsatisfactory performance? I was terminated, but not for performance issues, Morrison replied calmly. I was let go because I refused to cooperate with Mr. Whitfield's attempts to pressure his mother about financial matters. I told the agency that I couldn't work in an environment where the caregiver was being asked to participate in family conflicts. This exchange reinforced Morrison's credibility while raising additional questions about Richard Whitfield's motives and behavior. The defense then called several character witnesses who testified about Grace's reputation and professional competence. Mrs. Rodriguez, one of Grace's former clients, described Grace as the most caring and professional caregiver my family ever worked with. Mr. Thompson's daughter testified that Grace had actually saved her father's life by recognizing the early signs of a stroke and calling emergency services immediately. These testimonies created a portrait of Grace as a dedicated professional who consistently put her patients' needs above her own convenience, directly contradicting the prosecution's narrative of a careless employee who had abandoned her responsibilities. The most dramatic moment of the day came when Grace herself took the stand. She had initially been reluctant to testify, afraid that her nervousness might hurt her case. But, with the support of her sons and the confidence that came from having her story properly presented, she was ready to speak for herself. Grace's testimony began with her background and training, establishing her credentials as a professional caregiver. She spoke quietly but clearly about her 15 years in elder care and her specific experience with dementia patients. I loved taking care of Mrs. Whitfield, Grace testified. She reminded me of my own grandmother, and I wanted to make sure her final years were as comfortable as possible. Walsh guided Grace through the events of the day in question, allowing her to explain her decision-making process in her own words. When the pharmacy called to say Mrs. Whitfield's heart medication was ready and had to be picked up before closing, I knew I had a serious problem, Grace explained. Mrs. Whitfield had been having episodes with her heart, and her doctor had told me that missing even one dose could be dangerous. Grace described her thought process as she weighed the competing risks of leaving Eleanor alone versus allowing her to go without medication. I checked on Mrs. Whitfield, and she was resting peacefully in her bed. I made sure the bed rails were up and the call button was within reach. I planned to be gone for no more than 30 minutes, just long enough to get to the pharmacy and back. Walsh then asked Grace to address the prosecution's argument that she should have called for help rather than handling the situation herself. It was late afternoon on a Friday before a long weekend, Grace explained. Mr. Whitfield was at work and had said he wouldn't be available. The agency's emergency line was busy when I called. I felt like I had to make a choice, leave Mrs. Whitfield for a short time to get her medication, or let her go 3 days without heart pills that she needed to stay alive. The emotional weight of Grace's testimony was evident in her voice as she described the impossible choice she had faced. The jurors seemed engaged and sympathetic as she explained her reasoning. The cross-examination of Grace was intense, with Prosecutor Morrison attempting to portray her as someone who had prioritized her own convenience over her patient's safety. But Grace remained calm and consistent in her responses, repeatedly emphasizing that her decision had been based entirely on Mrs. Whitfield's medical needs. Ms. Johnson, wouldn't you agree that your primary responsibility was to stay with your patient regardless of other considerations? My primary responsibility was to keep Mrs. Whitfield safe and healthy, Grace replied firmly. That included making sure she had the medication she needed to prevent a heart attack. Morrison pressed harder, trying to get Grace to admit that she had violated agency protocols. But you knew that leaving a dementia patient alone was against agency policy. I knew the general policy, but I also knew that every situation is different. I was trained to use my professional judgment to prioritize my patient's medical needs. Grace's testimony concluded with a powerful statement about her dedication to her profession and her love for the patients she had served throughout her career. I never wanted anything bad to happen to Mrs. Whitfield, Grace said, tears forming in her eyes. She was a sweet lady who deserved better than what she got from her family situation. I did everything I could to take care of her, and I would make the same decision again if it meant getting her the medication she needed to stay alive. As Grace stepped down from the witness stand, the triplets felt a surge of pride in their mother's courage and dignity. She had faced aggressive questioning and personal attacks while maintaining her composure and telling her truth with quiet strength. The defense's final witness was a surprise, Dr. Margaret Foster, the cardiologist who had been treating Eleanor Whitfield for her heart condition. Dr. Foster had been subpoenaed by the defense and was not happy to be testifying, but her medical records supported Grace's account of the medication emergency. Mrs. Whitfield's heart condition was serious and required strict medication compliance, Dr. Foster testified reluctantly. Missing doses of her prescribed medication could indeed result in cardiac events that might be life-threatening. When asked about the specific medication that Grace had retrieved, Dr. Foster confirmed that it was a critical heart medication that should not be interrupted without medical supervision. In my medical opinion, ensuring that Mrs. Whitfield had access to her heart medication was a legitimate medical priority, Dr. Foster stated. The final day of the trial began with the prosecution's rebuttal case, as prosecutor Daniel Morrison attempted to repair the damage that the defense witnesses had inflicted on his narrative. He called Dr. Hamilton Reed back to the stand to address the testimony about emergency decision-making and medical priorities. Dr. Reed, having heard the defense testimony about Mrs. Whitfield's medication needs, does that change your opinion about the defendant's decision to leave her patient alone? Dr. Reed maintained his position with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his opinions accepted without question. No, it does not. While medication compliance is important, patient safety protocols exist precisely to prevent caregivers from making individual judgments that could result in harm. The defendant had alternatives available that would have addressed both concerns. Morrison then introduced phone records showing that Grace had not attempted to call the healthcare agency's emergency line until after she had already decided to leave the house. This evidence suggested that Grace had not exhausted all available options before making her decision. The evidence shows that Ms. Johnson made a unilateral decision without following proper protocols, Morrison argued. This case isn't about her intentions, which may have been good. It's about the consequences of her actions and her failure to follow established procedures designed to protect vulnerable patients. The prosecution's rebuttal was brief but focused, designed to remind the jury that good intentions don't excuse professional negligence. Morrison was careful to acknowledge Grace's years of service while maintaining that this particular decision had been unreasonable and had contributed to Eleanor Whitfield's death. During cross-examination, Jennifer Walsh was able to establish that the emergency line had indeed been busy when Grace first tried to call, supporting her testimony about attempting to follow procedures. but the prosecution had succeeded in raising questions about whether Grace had been sufficiently thorough in seeking alternatives before leaving Eleanor alone. The rebuttal phase concluded with a surprise witness that neither the defense nor the prosecution had anticipated. Judge Harrison announced that he had received a request from someone with information relevant to the case, and, after reviewing the potential testimony in chambers, he had decided to allow the witness to speak. The witness was Mrs. Dorothy Chen, an elderly Chinese-American woman who lived across the street from the Whitfield house. Mrs. Chen had not been interviewed by either the police or the attorneys, and her presence in the courtroom caught everyone by surprise. Mrs. Chen, speaking with a slight accent but clear authority, testified that she had been working in her garden on the afternoon of Eleanor's accident and had observed the events more closely than any of the other neighbors. "I saw Grace leave the house that day," Mrs. Chen testified. "But I also saw something else that I think is important. About 10 minutes after Grace left, I saw a man arrive at the house. He had a key and went inside." The courtroom erupted in whispers as the implications of this testimony became clear. Mrs. Chen continued, describing how she had seen the same man leave the house quickly about 20 minutes later, just before the emergency vehicles arrived. "I recognized the man because I had seen him visiting Mrs. Whitfield before. It was her son, Richard." Jennifer Walsh requested an immediate conference with the judge, as this testimony suggested that Richard Whitfield had been present in the house during the time when Eleanor's accident occurred. If true, it would completely change the timeline and the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's fall. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess while he considered how to handle this unexpected development. During the break, the triplets huddled with Walsh to discuss the implications of Mrs. Chen's testimony. If Richard was in the house when his mother fell, why didn't he call for help immediately? Marcus wondered aloud. And why didn't he mention this in his own testimony? Matthew's journalist instincts were fully engaged. This explains why Mrs. Chen wasn't interviewed before. The police investigation focused on the assumption that Eleanor was alone when she fell. They never canvassed the neighborhood thoroughly because they thought they already knew what had happened. Michael added, "This also explains why Eleanor might have tried to get out of bed. If she heard her son in the house and was afraid of him, she might have been trying to hide or escape." When court resumed, Judge Harrison announced that he was ordering a brief investigation into Mrs. Chen's testimony before proceeding with closing arguments. The prosecution requested additional time to verify the claims, while the defense argued that Mrs. Chen's testimony should be allowed to stand as presented. The judge ultimately decided to allow Mrs. Chen's testimony to remain in the record while ordering both sides to present any additional evidence they could gather quickly. He scheduled closing arguments for the following morning, giving the attorneys time to adjust their presentations based on this new information. That evening brought a flurry of activity as both legal teams scrambled to investigate Mrs. Chen's claims. Matthew used his contacts at the newspaper to access traffic camera footage and other records that might corroborate her testimony. Marcus researched legal precedents for cases where key evidence emerged late in proceedings. Michael reached out to his contacts in elder care advocacy to understand the implications of family members being present during accidents. The breakthrough came when Matthew discovered cell phone tower records that placed Richard Whitfield's phone in the vicinity of his mother's house during the time period Mrs. Chen had described. The records showed that Richard had made several phone calls from the area, including one to his lawyer, during the time when Grace was away from the house. More damaging was the discovery that Richard had called his insurance company approximately 15 minutes after the estimated time of his mother's fall, inquiring about coverage for home accidents involving elderly relatives. The timing suggested that Richard had known about the accident before the official emergency call was made. The final day of the trial began with Judge Harrison addressing the jury about Mrs. Chen's testimony and the additional evidence that had emerged. He instructed them to consider all the evidence presented while focusing on the specific charges against Grace Johnson. Prosecutor Morrison's closing argument attempted to minimize the impact of the new evidence while refocusing attention on Grace's decision to leave her patient. "Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of what else may have happened in the Whitfield house that day, the fact remains that Grace Johnson violated her professional duties by leaving a vulnerable patient alone," Morrison argued. "The tragic consequences of that decision speak for themselves. Morrison acknowledged that the case had become more complex but insisted that Grace's actions had created the conditions that led to Eleanor's death. We may never know exactly what happened in those final moments, Morrison continued. But we do know that if Grace Johnson had been in that house doing her job, Eleanor Whitfield would not have died alone and afraid on her bedroom floor. Jennifer Walsh's closing argument transformed the case from a story about negligent caregiving into a broader examination of family dynamics, professional challenges, and systemic inequalities. This case has never been about a careless caregiver, Walsh told the jury. It has been about a dedicated professional who was put in an impossible situation and made the best decision she could with the information available to her. Walsh walked the jury through Grace's 15-year career, her training and dedication, and the specific circumstances that had forced her to choose between two competing priorities on the day of the accident. Grace Johnson did not abandon Eleanor Whitfield, Walsh argued passionately. She made a professional decision to ensure that her patient had life-saving medication. The tragedy that followed was not the result of negligence, but of circumstances beyond Grace's control. Walsh then addressed the elephant in the room, the implications of Mrs. Chen's testimony about Richard Whitfield's presence at the house. We may never know exactly why Eleanor Whitfield tried to get out of bed that afternoon, Walsh said carefully. But we do know that Grace Johnson was not the only person who made decisions that day. We do know that this case has been presented to you with incomplete information. And we do know that Grace Johnson has been made a scapegoat for a tragedy that was much more complicated than the prosecution wanted you to believe. The jury deliberations lasted 2 full days, suggesting that the jurors were carefully considering all the evidence presented. During this time, the triplets maintained a constant vigil at the courthouse, supporting their mother through the agonizing wait. Grace remained remarkably calm during the deliberations, drawing strength from her son's presence and from her faith that the truth would ultimately prevail. She had done everything she could to tell her story honestly, and now the decision was out of her hands. On the afternoon of the second day, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread through the courthouse that the Johnson case was concluding. Judge Harrison called the court to order as Grace stood beside Jennifer Walsh, flanked by her 3 sons in the first row of the gallery. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged Hispanic man who had listened intently throughout the trial, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of negligent homicide, we find the defendant, Grace Johnson, not guilty. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers as Grace collapsed into her chair, overcome with relief and emotion. The triplets rushed forward to embrace their mother as tears flowed freely down all their faces. Judge Harrison called for order and addressed the jury, thanking them for their service and dismissing them from their duties. He then turned to Grace and spoke directly to her. "Ms. Johnson, you are free to go," Judge Harrison said. "I want to say that this case has been a reminder that our justice system works best when all the facts are presented and when people are willing to stand up for what is right." The judge paused, looking at the triplets who had never left their mother's side throughout the ordeal. "Your sons have shown remarkable dedication to seeking truth and justice," Judge Harrison continued. "They have honored both you and this court with their commitment to ensuring that all relevant evidence was brought to light." As the courtroom began to empty, Prosecutor Morrison approached the defense table with an expression that mixed disappointment with professional respect. "Ms. Johnson, I want you to know that this case was never personal," Morrison said quietly. "I was doing my job based on the evidence I had available. I'm glad that all the facts came to light." Grace shook Morrison's hand with grace and dignity. "I understand, Mr. Morrison. I just hope this case helps people understand how hard it is to make the right decisions when you're caring for someone else's family." Outside the courthouse, the Johnson family was greeted by a small crowd of supporters, including several of Grace's former clients and colleagues from the healthcare community. The local news media was also present, and Matthew found himself in the unusual position of being interviewed about a story he had helped investigate. "This case was about much more than my mother," Matthew told the reporters. "It was about the challenges that healthcare workers face every day, and the importance of looking beyond simple explanations when tragedies occur." Marcus added, "Our mother spent 15 years caring for other people's loved ones. She didn't deserve to have her life destroyed because she made a difficult decision in an emergency situation. Michael spoke about the systemic issues revealed by the case. This trial showed how easy it is for healthcare workers to become scapegoats when families are looking for someone to blame for inevitable tragedies. We need to do better at supporting the people who care for our most vulnerable citizens. Grace herself spoke briefly to the media, expressing her gratitude for the support she had received and her hope that the case would lead to better understanding of the challenges faced by eldercare workers. "I never stopped believing that the truth would come out," Grace said with quiet strength. "My boys never gave up on me, and the jury was willing to look beyond the surface to understand what really happened." As they walked away from the courthouse together, the Johnson family knew that their ordeal had changed them all. The triplets had used their education and skills to fight for justice, proving that their mother's sacrifices had been worthwhile. Grace had rediscovered her own strength and dignity after months of feeling helpless and alone. But, perhaps most importantly, the trial had exposed the complex realities of eldercare work and the systemic inequalities that make healthcare workers vulnerable to scapegoating when tragedies occur. The case had become a symbol of the need for better support and protection for the dedicated professionals who provide care for society's most vulnerable members. The shocking truth that Judge Harrison had discovered was not just about the specific circumstances of Eleanor Whitfield's death, but about the broader patterns of bias and assumption that had shaped the case from the beginning. 3 black triplets had defended their mother not just in court, but in the larger struggle for justice and equality that continues to define American society. The Johnson family's fight had ended in victory, but their larger mission to advocate for healthcare workers and vulnerable communities was just beginning. This testimony from Eleanor's own doctor provided crucial medical validation for Grace's decision-making process. If the patient's cardiologist agreed that the medication was critically important, it became much harder for the prosecution to argue that Grace's decision had been unreasonable. As the 4th day of trial concluded, the defense had successfully presented an alternative narrative that portrayed Grace as a dedicated professional who had made a difficult decision based on her patient's medical needs. The character witnesses had established her reputation for competence and caring, while the expert testimony had provided professional support for her decision-making process. But the triplets knew that the prosecution would have an opportunity for rebuttal witnesses and closing arguments that could potentially undermine the defense case. The trial was far from over, and the final outcome would depend on how effectively each side could persuade the jury to accept their version of events. That evening, as the Johnson family gathered once again in Grace's apartment, there was a sense of cautious optimism that had been absent for months. Grace had told her story with dignity and conviction, and the defense witnesses had provided strong support for her case. "You did great today, Mama," Marcus said, giving his mother a hug. "The jury could see who you really are." But Grace remained realistic about the challenges ahead. "The prosecution is going to fight back hard tomorrow," she said. "They've invested too much in this case to give up easily." Michael nodded in agreement. "But we've given the jury a lot to think about. They've heard the truth about what really happened, and they've seen the kind of person you are." As they prepared for what might be the final day of testimony, the Johnson family knew that they had done everything possible to present Grace's case fairly and honestly. The rest would be up to 12 jurors who would have to decide whether Grace Johnson was a criminal who had abandoned her patient or a dedicated caregiver who had made the best decision she could under impossible circumstances. "Mama, you need to tell this story in court," Marcus said gently. "The jury needs to understand the full context of what you were dealing with." Grace nodded reluctantly. "I've never talked publicly about my patient's private affairs. It feels wrong, even now. But I suppose my silence isn't protecting anyone anymore." As they prepared for the defense phase of the trial, the Johnson family felt cautiously optimistic. They had identified weaknesses in the prosecution's case and assembled evidence that could counter the narrative of negligence and abandonment. But they also knew that challenging a well-prepared prosecution with credible expert witnesses would require perfect execution of their own strategy. The next morning would bring the beginning of the defense case, and, for the first time since the trial began, Grace would have the opportunity to tell her own story. The triplets had given her the tools and support she needed to fight back, but ultimately, her freedom would depend on whether 12 jurors could see past the prosecution's narrative to understand the truth about what had happened in the Whitfield house that terrible afternoon. Judge Harrison's courtroom had become the battleground where Grace's future would be decided, and, as the defense prepared to present their case, every person in the Johnson family understood that they were fighting not just for Grace's freedom, but for justice itself. To pick up medication at 3:10 p.m. So Mrs. Whitfield was alone for 37 minutes before the accident occurred. Based on those timestamps, yes. In your experience, is 37 minutes an unusually long time for a dementia patient to be alone? The EMT hesitated. Well, it depends on the patient's condition and the safety precautions in place. Many dementia patients are left alone for short periods while caregivers handle necessary tasks. This testimony began to chip away at the prosecution's narrative of immediate abandonment leading to tragic consequences. The timeline suggested that Eleanor's fall was a random accident rather than the inevitable result of Grace's absence. As the second day of trial concluded, the triplets felt cautiously optimistic about their ability to challenge the prosecution's case. They had identified weaknesses in the timeline, raised questions about witness credibility, and begun to present a more nuanced picture of the circumstances surrounding Eleanor Whitfield's death. But they also knew that the most challenging part of the trial was still ahead. The prosecution would likely present medical experts and industry professionals who would testify about standards of care and professional responsibilities. The defense would need to counter with their own experts and present a compelling alternative narrative about what had really happened in the Whitfield house. That evening, as they prepared for the next day's proceedings, Grace looked at her 3 sons with a mixture of pride and worry. "I never wanted to put you boys in this position," she said. "You've all worked so hard to build your own lives and careers. This case could affect your reputations too." Marcus reached over and took his mother's hand. "Mama, everything we've achieved is because of the sacrifices you made and the values you taught us. Fighting for you isn't just about family loyalty. It's about fighting for justice and truth." The battle was far from over, but, for the first time since the trial began, Grace allowed herself to hope that her sons might actually be able to save her from the nightmare that had consumed her life for the past 6 months. Elder man in his 50s who spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. He testified about his mother's condition and his family's decision to hire a live-in caregiver to ensure her safety. "We specifically requested someone who would be there at all times," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion. "My mother was frightened and confused, and we needed someone who would never leave her alone." Grace Johnson assured us she understood these requirements, and we trusted her completely. Under cross-examination, Jennifer Walsh tried to establish that caring for dementia patients was inherently challenging and that accidents could happen even with the best care. But Richard Whitfield's responses were smooth and well-prepared, deflecting any suggestion that his mother's death was simply a tragic accident. The next witness was Dr. Patricia Stevens, the emergency room physician who had treated Eleanor Whitfield after her fall. Dr. Stevens testified about the severity of the injuries and the factors that had contributed to Eleanor's death several weeks later. "In my medical opinion," Dr. Stevens stated, "if Mrs. Whitfield had received immediate assistance after her fall, her chances of survival would have been significantly higher. The delay in getting medical attention complicated her condition and contributed to the infections that ultimately led to her death." This testimony was particularly damaging because it suggested that Grace's absence had not just caused the accident, but had actually contributed to Eleanor's death. The prosecution was building a case for negligent homicide that could result in serious prison time for Grace. As the day progressed, the triplets took careful notes and exchanged meaningful glances. They could see the strategy the prosecution was using, and they began to formulate their own plan to counter it. But they also realized that the evidence they had discovered might not be enough to overcome the narrative that was being constructed around their mother. The courtroom was filled with tension as each witness testified, and Grace sat quietly at the defense table, her dignity intact despite the accusations being hurled against her. The triplets knew that their mother's freedom, reputation, and future all hung in the balance of what would happen in this courtroom over the next few days. As the first day of testimony concluded, Judge Harrison dismissed the jury with instructions to return the following morning. The prosecution had made a strong impression, and the defense seemed to be struggling to keep pace. But the real battle was just beginning, and the triplets were determined to fight for their mother's vindication with everything they had.